rivers change their sides, but never leave the stream of warm permanent sand. So the days float as they're quite aware of what they're going through.
For that comments, I think you've raised two of the critical issues of how to about the running up of expectations against the problem of creating a post-racial and post-neoliberal order, which I think is the two biggest obstacles that we face right now in terms of trying about expectations running against those obstacles. Our next speaker is Abbie Bakan, who teaches at the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, and of course is well known for writings on migration, domestic workers, and hundreds of other things. So, Abbie.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to the Socialist Project for inviting me, National Socialist, to co-sponsor and organize this meeting, and thank you to my fellow panelists, Herman and Ajamu, for contributing a lot of interesting points that, in terms of this question, I think we're going to be discussing it for a long time. I think, you know, we're sort of all aware that there are two possible pitfalls in terms of the question of the election of Barack Obama to the U.S. presidency. On the one hand, there's the danger of being so over the moon that, you know, we have overcome and demobilizing. You know, the high expectations that can then create a sense of passivity and faith in the structures of the American system. But the other danger is putting ourselves as socialists, as critics, in a position of sort of, you know, crossing our arms and saying, boy, this really isn't as good as it looks, and being overly negative and not recognizing the sense of hope and change as something that's not just false consciousness or some type of grand illusion. And it's the latter that, you know, for some of us who've been around a little while, we probably have to temper a bit, you know, the position of being a universal critic. We have seen great expectations of leaders before. We saw, some of us are old enough to remember the election of Salvador Allende to Chile in 1970, the election of Nelson Mandela to South Africa in 1994. I mean, we have seen great expectations that have been dashed, and they have been dashed in such a way that people are completely devastated for many, many years. And, you know, there is a risk of this. Ralph Nader, for example, I think has responded in quite a sectarian manner to the election of Barack Obama, referring to him as either Uncle Sam or Uncle Tom. I mean, these types of comments, which are really dismissive not only of what the Obama phenomenon represents, but of those who have put their hopes and energies into it. So what I think we're witnessing is something that has quite complex terrain to it, and it's important that we try to get it right, because I think there are fantastic opportunities that are posed right now, not only because of the election of Obama, but also because of the economic situation, because of a sense of the end of Bush in a series of ways that opens up the possibility of something else. And I think the overriding character of the election of Barack Obama, is its anti-Bush character. And there's a couple of ways in which I want to sort of demonstrate that argument. The first one is just the way in which the election took place. I think it had a number of phases. And the second thing that I'd like to talk about are what I think are sort of three vectors of kind of instability that materialized around and through the Obama election, but weren't actually about Barack Obama. And these sort of, you know, sort of strands of instability and change have to do, on the one hand, with race and racism, not only in terms of the question of the history of racism and slavery and African-American racism, but also the configuration of domestic racism with the international situation around Islamophobia. Secondly, in terms of war and imperialism, particularly the ideological framing of Bush's strategic plan and what was called the, you know, sort of the Bush doctrine and the project for a new American century. And thirdly, and what I think became most important towards the end of the election, and I think will continue to be with us, are the sort of instability posed by the current economic crisis and the breaking up of the ideological confidence around neoliberalism and a return to a sort of odd kind of ad hoc neo-Keynesianism, which I think has been something that has benefited Obama. So first let me just talk a little bit about the election. Despite Ralph Nader's assessment, that again I do think was actually quite sectarian and has not done him any favors in terms of his efforts to try to break the two-party hegemony in the United States, I think he is correct to say that the two parties, the Republicans and Democrats, have more in common in their social and class composition than what divides them. If you look at the history, if you look at the origins of the parties, if you look at their relationship around sections of capital and around racism, there's actually much more that's the same than different about those parties, the duopoly phenomenon. But the election of Barack Obama not only successfully broke the color bar to the job of the President of the United States, it took a considerable social force to do that. It wasn't something that could be done simply by force of personality or charisma. And the impact of it is profound. Just speaking personally, my family is from Chicago, and we left when I was a child in 1968, in part because of the Vietnam War, and my parents had 4 boys, but also because of the incredible racism that was associated with the sort of police city-state of Mayor Daley, and you know, the sense of despair and division and violence that was inherent in anyone who was sort of part of an anti-racist framework. So we know that without the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, without the Black Power movement, without the massive movement that saw many die, literally, in fighting against racism, the phenomenon that is Barack Obama and Michelle Obama simply wouldn't have existed. I mean, there wasn't a possibility of the education, of the open doors, and so on without that mass movement. But the election actually had 3 phases. It wasn't only about the question of election of Obama. The first, I think, was during the primaries, when it was a competition between Obama and Hillary Clinton. And in terms of sort of the role of the Obama election, the American election as a world election, eyes were really focused on that competition. And it was very close up until the very last phases. And around that time, what we saw, I think, was the cracking of the Clinton machine of the Democratic Party. And without that machine being broken, the distance of the Democratic Party from the Republican Party would have been much harder to manage. The second phase was once it had been declared that it was going to be a competition between Obama and McCain, it was a tight contest. It was a tight contest. And at that moment, Obama revealed his other side. That was when the international tour took place, when he gave disgusting celebratory comments and nods to Israel, where he talked about the dangers of terrorism, the importance of increasing mobilization in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He had those positions beforehand, but he made a point of making them quite public. The appointment of Joe Biden was an indication of that. This was a reminder that Obama was not only going to fill the holes in his resume around experience, but he also demonstrated that some white people who were racist were okay with him, that he knew how to negotiate those spaces. And that's also when the corporate donations that became one central pillar of the Obama campaign were sort of proudly touted. So at this stage, the only substantive issue in the election between the Democrats and the Republicans was the issue of the war in Iraq. And that was a substantial issue because McCain was for the war in Iraq, bomb, 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 and ran. I mean, he was horrible about it, saying we might be there for 100 years and so on. And Obama pressed the point that he had opposed the war in Iraq. He didn't oppose imperialism, he didn't oppose war in general, but he opposed the war in Iraq, and if you look closely at the reasons for it, it was largely because it wasn't going very well, because he didn't think it was winnable. But this phase was a tight race, and then something changed. Something changed in the race. Now, that had to do with the appointment of the Veeps. We did see the Sarah Palin factor, which was unfortunate. And we got into the competition, in terms of the question of gender, race, identity. There were a lot of those questions through the course of the election. The reason I think they were so high profile is because there was so little actual politics. There was so little content that people focused on the question of the identity issues. But the decisive factor in the final stretch of the election, I believe, was the overwhelming crisis in the American economy and the financial sector, which made a larger section of the population, including sections of the working class, including sections of the white working class, say we need something that is as far away from Bush as we can get. And Bush was associated with neoliberalism, with a deregulated economy, with allowing the market to work out all of the problems of the population, and it was simply impossible for McCain to distance himself from that, and that was played by the Obama election. So that's sort of how I see, sort of what happened. We kind of had 3 elections, but at the same time, it wasn't just the election that led to the election. And I'm saying all this by way of indicating that I think we have to know what's changed and what hasn't. I do think what we have seen has changed is the end of everything that George Bush was trying to achieve as a ruling class particular hegemonic project, the project for a new American century, the post-9/11 model, the free market, the neoliberalism on a world scale, has actually shifted. But what hasn't shifted is US imperialism, capitalism, class society, a racist society. We're seeing what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called the hegemonic bloc. We're seeing a change in the hegemonic bloc. We're seeing a change in the way the ruling class rules. And that's important. And that also changes the way in which there's a process of consent with those who are ruled. To what extent will they agree, and to what extent will they disagree? And that's where the job of socialists come in. On racism, racism intersects with capitalism in a lot of different ways. We know that race doesn't actually exist. As a scientific, biological category, there simply is no such thing. There is absolutely no correlation between skin pigmentation or hair color or dentifrice with any other single human characteristics. Zero, none. But racism is very real, and it's a very powerful ideological, and it becomes an economic subject. It becomes raised to the level of practice because it organizes the way in which people interact in very serious ways around borders, around the labor market, around family relationships, around citizenship, and so on. In the post-World War II period, we saw a sort of expansion of open doors around racism because there was a labor market shortage in most of the advanced capitalist countries. And so there was a general expansion of nominal legal equality. Racism continued, but there was a general liberalization. With post-9/11, that shifted. With 9/11 and the events that came after that, open Islamophobia, open overt racial profiling on the basis of those who, quote unquote, looked like terrorists was legitimated by the highest authorities of the land with a remarkable synchrony. And the notion of security, cultures, and so on and so forth was all associated with it. You couldn't explicitly say race, and people still don't believe it's really about racism. But anyone who experiences the phenomenon of traveling while Arab knows exactly that there is overt racial profiling. So in increasing one form of racism, Islamophobia, it wasn't invented with 9/11. It echoed historical patterns of Orientalism, of anti-Arab racism grounded in even a concession to Israeli ethnic cleansing. Palestinians have known for decades the ultimate Arab terrorists and so on. But the entry of an African-American president into the White House has been identified, I believe, by a section of the US elite as a means of rationalizing and allowing Islamophobia to be more legitimated. And this didn't start with Obama. It actually goes back to Colin Powell. You could see it very clearly in terms of the Condoleezza Rice phenomenon being the principal actor who was involved with the Middle East. But to give you an example, just a way the sort of ideology is taking shape here, this is a New York Times reportage of an authenticated al-Qaeda deputy. Some of you might have seen this, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who warned of Barack Obama's presidency in terms of the question of Muslims worldwide. And the response in the New York Times was, for years the terrorist networks sought to fuel anti-Americanism with prolific audio and video recordings vilifying President Bush as the leading American crusader against Muslim nations. The election of Mr. Obama, a black man who spent part of his childhood in Indonesia and whose father was from a Muslim family, has muddled al-Qaeda's message. Similarly, The Economist, which is one of those lovely publications where you can get very blunt ruling class public opinion, put it this way. This was when they decided to endorse Obama in the weeks prior to the election. Is Mr. Obama any better? Most of the hoopla about him has been about what he is rather than what he would do. His identity is not as irrelevant as it sounds. Merely by becoming president, he would dispel many of the myths built up about America. It would be far harder for the spreaders of hate in the Islamic world to denounce the great Satan if he were led by a black man whose middle name is Hussein, and far harder for autocrats around the world to claim that American democracy is a sham. This goes on, and I think Obama has actually been constructed for the role, and he's on for it. He's absolutely on for it. As my colleague Shireen Razek has put it, exactly how many times does Obama have to deny that he is a Muslim? You know, the phenomenon of him insisting on his Christianity, of his, you know, Americanism and so on, this is what Americans look like. He's the one who can deal with it. The theoretical generalization of Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, finds an echo in terms of an elimination of the Bush doctrine, but a continuation of many of the features of foreign policy that were characteristic of it. So this brings me to the question of the war. The centerpiece, the essential element in the background, and I think of the demise of the two George W. Bush administrations, is the failure of the US-led war on Iraq. It's expressed most clearly in the publication of the Iraq Study Group statement, the Baker Study Group that was published in 2005, where a section of the American ruling class has basically come to terms with the fact that it's not working, it's too expensive, and there has to be an exit strategy. So this was a war that was supposed to be a stepping stone to a post-Cold War reassertion of US global power. This was going to be the war against the axis of evil. It was going to be a combination of military occupations, economic isolation, leading to the reassertion post-Cold War of American global hegemony on a world scale. It was associated very closely with a developed think tank, the Project for a New American Century. It was closely associated with individuals, Dick Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Louis Libby, Scooter, and so on. People know, by the way, that Dick Cheney's just been indicted. Okay. Give that a moment. Okay. So to the extent that there was a programmatic difference between Obama and McCain, it was around the war in Iraq. And the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, goes back, you know, to before 9/11. But after 9/11, there was the publication of the new Grand American Strategy, which you can read, and it explicitly articulates the Project of the New American Century vision. And the notion is that America is the dominant force in the world, but we have enemies, and any of those two enemies, China was identified, India was identified, were to ally against themselves together, we would have a situation of, we would call it inter-imperialist rivalry, but competition that would actually clip the wings of the United States on a global scale. So what we have to do, and this is the part that was called the Bush Doctrine, is assert our military strength in preemptive strikes. Even if our enemies are not organized, we have to be prepared to show them our military power. So the phenomenon of Afghanistan, Iraq, it was going to be Syria, it was going to be Korea, and so on and so forth, was supposed to reassert a global pattern associated with George Bush. And this is in shambles. And it's important for us to know that this is in shambles. And it's a feature of the success of the resistance in Iraq, the resistance of the global anti-war movement, the organized resistance of the American population, the soldiers refusing to serve, the soldiers who have come and, refused and come to Canada to seek refuge. That movement has actually sufficiently stayed the hand of American imperialism that we can expect that Obama will organize some type of a retreat from Iraq. It's not going to be a complete retreat. He's already backtracking. There will be some bases and so on. But it's a sign of a failure of what was the defining moment of American imperialism for recent years. So those of us who have had the privilege and the opportunity to travel to the Cairo Conference Against Foreign Imperialism know that the anti-war movement has been organizing relentlessly in country after country, in the region and internationally. And there will, part of the sense of celebration associated with Obama will be the sense that Bush, which seemed unbeatable, the imperial juggernaut that seemed unbeatable, has had something on the back foot. Now, again, that's not to say that it's the whole story. It's absolutely not. But it might take us some time to come to terms with what has happened with an exposure of the complete falsehood of the notion of weapons of mass destruction that took the United States out of the international arena on its own, and that's been exposed as an absolute and complete lie. That's actually an important historical moment in terms of the transition of American ruling class power. That's on one level. The other level is domestically the costs of the war, and the war in Afghanistan, of course, is being presented as the war that's not the war on Iraq, and that is, this is cause for a tremendous amount of alert. But the other feature of the long war and the war on terror not going the way that Bush wanted it to is the cost of it, the cost to the U.S. Economy, the cost domestically. And the turning point for that was Hurricane Katrina. At that moment, that disaster, a natural disaster that took place in August of 2005, was not just a natural disaster. It was an organized, man-made disaster because the mechanisms of dealing with the levees, of dealing with the support for the population, was totally associated with the crisis of neoliberalism. And that brings me to the final point. If we have vectors of racism, we have vectors of war, then we have a big one. The failure of the market and the close association of the Bush administration with the love of the market. A Marxist fetish, absolute love of the market. And this was the last element in sort of a perfect storm that culminated on November 4th, 2008, with the election of Barack Obama. The sense of change, the sense of hope, the sense of something different was used by the Obama campaign to its advantage. But at the same time, McCain's inability to distance the Republican Party from that project, because there was no debate in the Republican Party at all about that project, and there probably wouldn't have been as much of a debate had the Clinton machine not been sort of pushed aside in terms of the Obama election. But as it turned out, there was a capacity in the Obama campaign to act as if it was something new, something fresh, and maybe we can have an alternative to this. Let me give you a quote from Time magazine. On the day Lehman Brothers evaporated, McCain was running 2 points ahead. In September, when the Wall Street Journal asked people who was better on taxes, McCain beat Obama 41% to 37%. Over the next month, there was an 18-point swing, until Obama prevailed on taxes 48% to 34%. The Obama campaign never missed a chance to replay McCain's quotes about the fundamentals of the economy being strong, or that he was, quote, fundamentally a deregulator at a time when regulation was fundamentally overdue. Now, neoliberalism is not going to play dead in a second, but it is being abandoned in an ad hoc manner, not being replaced by socialism, as there are right-wing Republicans that are screaming socialism, but a kind of neo-Keynesianism that is about the state. It's about the capitalist state acting as a capitalist, playing a role, intervening to bail out private capital when it starts to go into a crisis. And we don't know how deep this will go. We know it's not over, and we know it's going to continue for a while, but we don't know how deep it's going to go. But one thing that we do know is that the ideological crisis associated with the failure of neoliberalism, with the failure of the market, there's no trickle-down taking place. The ideological crisis is profound. Just to give you an example, this is another quote. This is from Wednesday's Globe and Mail about the Harvard Business School, which is now celebrating its 100th year. And it's talking about libraries. The red brick Baker Library at the Harvard Business School is a shrine to U.S. capitalism, a hushed sanctuary where young managers have for 8 decades prepared for glittering careers on Wall Street and in Fortune 500 companies. But these days, it contains reminders of how fast and how far the mighty have fallen. In the lobby, stacks of brochures promote the library's valuable collection of old finance deal books. The donor, Lehman Brothers, a 160-year-old Wall Street investment bank that, in September, collapsed under the weight of its own bad assets. In the future, Harvard business students will be looking not for genius, but for clues to the great economic crisis of 2008 and the implosion of the U.S. enterprise model. So this is the press that Harvard Business School is getting on its 100th anniversary. So the Chicago School of Economics that has prided itself in Milton freedom is faltering, and the ghost of John Maynard Keynes is coming back. in the midst of a kind of desperate search for some type of a reversal of the market madness. Keynes was a British conservative. There was nothing left about him. And he combined an alliance of right-wing advocates with an earlier period of the falling market with social democrats and reformers. Whether we're going to see some kind of a new alliance of that sort or not, we don't know. But we know that the fact that Keynes and Keynesianism is even being discussed is a sign of the dramatic change, because Keynes was considered histoire in terms of economics from the mid-1970s, to about, yesterday. And the pendulum is swinging back towards state intervention. And I think it means that, if there is a search for new ideas, then we who are socialists have to be on the market of new ideas. We're the ones who have to be there. When there's these big questions being asked, then we have to know that it's really not time for Keynes, it's time for Marx. And there are lots of, Marx has been criticized a lot, and there's lots of room for criticizing Marx, and he wrote a very long time ago. But the basic argument that capitalism is a system that goes into business cycles because it is profoundly based on a desire for an expansion of the market and not the satisfaction of human need, that fundamental insight that is the reason why we pay attention to Marx in the contemporary period is actually more relevant than ever. It's more relevant than ever. So for many of us who, sort of look optimistically at Obama's promise of change, I think we have to understand that what happened was a juggernaut, a sort of like, a beast was created to knock out Bush and what he stood for. But it's not at all the case that what is being replaced is anti-capitalism. It's a new phase of capitalism. It's a new phase, a post-neoliberal phase, a new way for the ruling class to rule. It's contradictory, it's unstable, and it's taking place in a time of economic crisis where the only possible way out is if there's going to be some type of a massive amount of redistribution of the surplus, and at this point, there's no sign of that. The other thing is it's important to know that Obama, while he is against the war in Iraq, is in no way against war. And the day that we were celebrating, that those of us who've been watching the news and who wasn't doing that, the day that we were celebrating in an Afghani village near Kandahar city, warplanes, U.S. warplanes, took the life of between 50 and 90 innocent Afghanis at a wedding. And the bride spent her wedding night in Kandahar City Hospital with several children full of shrapnel. And we only know this because there were reporters there at the time. So Obama's strategy with the Toronto Coalition to Stop the War, was said in his press statement, is out of Iraq and into Afghanistan. That's the strategy. The only change, we need change, we need change. The only change that Obama wants to see in Afghanistan is more troops. A stronger American military presence to occupy Afghanistan and to control the gas and oil that country and the route that it's on. And at the same time, the U.S. right has not disappeared, and right-wing ideas have not disappeared. As people were putting their ballots in to vote for Obama, Proposition 8 in California received the greatest media attention because it was the elimination of same-sex marriage. But it's hard to find information about this, but one of the articles that I've seen about this is starting to tally up the number of states that had, it's all very decentralized, the number of states that had anti-same-sex marriage. It looks like about 30, and in all of them, same-sex marriage was challenged. It was successful. Wherever there was a ballot, it was challenged. So the Christian right that generated the likes of a George Bush and the likes of a Sarah Palin still exists. And we can be sure that there are meetings like this of people from all political spectrums in the United States who are doing their assessments of Obama. And there will be a competition for ideas. But I also think that for those of us who are socialists, for those of us who are Marxists, for those of us who want to see change, we have a huge opportunity here. We have a huge opportunity. There's an open door. And if we can create some examples, if we can create some examples here in Canada, the indication of this, the Good Jobs Conference, the incredible support for that is an indication there's an appetite, there's a sense of a need for change, for independent, real change from below. If we can play a role in that and set an example, then it's possible that we're going to see some much deeper changes in America than Barack Obama anticipated.